just making sure this is registering. Okay, great. I'm so pleased to welcome all of you for this morning's important conversation with Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Emily Mendrala, about the new Central America Forward initiative. For 40 years, the Inter-American Dialogue has engaged in Central America, both on the ground and through policy recommendation, on how to improve economic conditions, leverage remittances, address migration, improve education, and more recently on addressing climate change and, of course, countering the very alarming democratic backsliding we're seeing in much of Central America. The Biden administration has emphasized its commitment to the region from the start. And it's worth noting that it was also a priority during the Obama administration, and Vice President Biden at the time led that effort with the Central American Root Causes Strategy. In February 2021, President Biden's executive order expanded the root causes approach, and the administration later established the Partnership for Central America, and now in 2023, Central America Forward. A year ago, the dialogue hosted Assistant Secretary Brian Nichols for a conversation that included the root causes strategy. Today, we're very pleased to host a conversation with you, the audience, with DAS Emily Mendrala and with our own Manuel Orozco, the director of our Migration, Remittances, and Development Program, to discuss the significance and the potential of this new initiative. Manuel is going to give Emily a more fulsome introduction, but I just want to say that I had the privilege to work with Emily during the Obama administration, and I was always impressed with the depth of her understanding of the nuanced nature of all of the Americas. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank Emily and the entire team for the tremendous work that they did to help secure the release of 222 Nicaraguan political prisoners. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Manuel.
It's just as Rebecca says, the administration has really expressed a significant commitment in writing and in practice over how to address Central America. Of course, first of all, on reducing migration, and second, to look at the root causes of it. It's a complex issue, but you do have at least 5 different frameworks to work with, in addition to the executive decree to review CAFTA, as well as the root causes strategy, the approach on a guest worker program is also an important step forward. And then you have the PCA, the Partnership for Central America, and now Central America Forward. So, we want to see, how does that work? What do you expect to see the results? And, tell us a little bit about it. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here. A big thank you to the Inter-American Dialogue, to Rebecca, to Manuel, and to all of you for coming, and hello to those who are joining virtually as well. I first of all have to say that I really, really value the Inter-American Dialogue, the space that it creates for discussion on some of the most pressing policy issues facing the Americas, and bringing together a really diverse set of stakeholders, private sector, public, civil society organizations from across the region to engage in some of these discussions and form policy recommendations. So thank you to the role that each of you play in that. I am here today to speak about a new initiative on the part of the administration called Central America Forward. And as Rebecca and Manuel both noted, this is a piece of a larger effort, a larger strategy that the administration has vis-a-vis Central America to promote societies that are prosperous, stable, democratic. And there are several strategies and lines of effort governing that. The root causes strategy was published in the summer of 2021. and identifies lines of effort that address economic drivers of migration, security drivers of migration, governance drivers of migration, climate, gender-based violence, and directs the administration to work across several lines of effort to address those drivers of migration. The Vice President Harris, in May of 2021, announced the call to action for Central America. This was a call to action for investment, private sector investment in Northern Central America to create jobs, to create economic opportunity, and to address the economic drivers of migration. Over the last 18 months, working in partnership with the private sector, working in partnership with the Partnership for Central America, a private sector partner, we have galvanized more than $4.2 billion in private sector investment for Northern Central America. Today, I'm here to talk about the next phase, the next chapter of that partnership called Central America Forward, launched on February 6th by Vice President Harris. Now, Central America Forward goes beyond addressing just the economic drivers of migration and instead leverages the private sector to achieve more comprehensive goals. The strength of the private sector to address, for example, good governance, labor rights, and it includes U.S. government efforts to come alongside, complement, and support private sector investments as well. Two highlights that I'm going to focus on today under Central America Forward are a newly launched investment facilitation team and the Good Governance, Good Jobs initiative. First of all, the investment facilitation team, the State Department is very pleased, proud, excited to lead a new interagency effort to support clean energy investments, clean energy infrastructure projects from concept to financing in Central America. We are focusing on this because in conversations with stakeholders, with companies, with civil society, with potential investors, with governments, we have found that the lack of clean energy infrastructure is a primary constraint to economic growth in Central America. The investment facilitation team for Central America will build on and learn from lessons of a similar initiative in the Caribbean housed under PAC 2030 to bring together the U.S. government interagency to determine ways that we can support clean energy infrastructure projects. It's still in its nascent stages. We are happy to have brought together a team that includes a bit of an alphabet soup from the U.S. government. So I'll read my notes. We've got the State Department's team from Central American Affairs, Energy and Economic Bureaus, and interagency partners, including USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, USTDA, U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, Development Finance Corporation, DFC, Department of Commerce, and the Export-Import Bank, XM. We look forward to working with the investment facilitation team on 5 main tasks. Together, we will work to identify a pipeline of projects, develop technical assistance packages to support project preparation, identify a mechanism to vet local partners, showcase projects to potential investors, and facilitate access to financing for these projects. Private sector, of course, plays a critical role here, and we must continue collaboration with the private sector moving forward. And we will look to outside voices like you as well to provide comments on the investment facilitation team. The second line of effort that I want to highlight under Central America Forward is the Good Governance, Good Jobs initiative or declaration. In February 6th, while the Vice President was launching Central America Forward, the State Department and the Partnership for Central America put out a joint declaration, a Good Governance, Good Jobs declaration. And the declaration highlights the important role that our partnership with the private sector can play in fostering an environment where rule of law and decent work can flourish. I'm going to highlight some key tenets of our shared interests that were enshrined in the declaration. These include due diligence and adoption of good practice, including meaningful stakeholder engagement, compliance with domestic and international laws, including work to eliminate corruption, the rights of freedom of association and to collective bargaining, the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, the effective abolition of child labor, the elimination of human trafficking, the elimination of unlawful discrimination, including based on gender, in respect for employment and occupation, a safe and healthy working environment. And the pledge and our action underscores that investment must come hand in hand with good governance. We will not turn a blind eye to bad behavior that enables corruption or violates human rights as seemingly separate from economic goals. We know that the private sector holds significant influence and should be a force for good, and those who join us must be up for the task. The final thing I will highlight, and I really look forward to questions from this group, is progress thus far. We've had 18 months under our belt under the call to action. Central America Forward was launched a month ago, and we have ambitious plans, but it's worth reflecting on the last 18 months under the call to action to see what has been accomplished to date. I noted already the $4.2 billion in investment that the call to action has garnered. We are going to be paying very close attention to how that investment manifests in the region. The Partnership for Central America has also identified goals for the region, including job creation, financial inclusion, digital access, gender equity, education and training, access to capital, and investments in infrastructure. Many of the commitments, the financial commitments, represent a 10-year timeframe. However, we're already seeing mobilization on the ground. Since May 2021, companies have deployed over $650 million in investment, loans, and procurement. This includes approximately $100 million in El Salvador, $215 million in Guatemala, and $337 million in Honduras. Additionally, companies report that they have created more than 15,000 jobs across the region, connected 4 million people to the internet, brought more than 1 million people into the formal financial economy, and trained more than 160 million people to enhance workforce development. This includes digital and language skilling and programs that lead to certification and employment. We've got a lot of work to do. We want to do so in a comprehensive way to leverage the private sector, leverage the investments in Central America to promote rule of law, good governance, good jobs, fair work environments. And we have to work hand in hand with stakeholders across the private sector, government officials, civil society organizations, and policy leaders, such as many of you in this room. Look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Like Rebecca says, Emily is brilliant, so I had to prepare myself with some material so I could be informed and prepared too for the Q&A. So I have a couple of questions that I like to ask. Well, I have a lot of questions that I like to ask, but the floor is yours, so I'm just going to take two. The first one is that it seems to me that there is definitely a lot of brains thinking through Central America from different angles. And the root causes strategy is definitely beyond an academic exercise. It's a good framework that deals with a lot of problems that we're facing right now. The guest worker program, the increasing of H-2B visas in particular more than H-2A is really a fundamental shift in a context where most of the labor that comes from Central America doesn't work in agriculture, but 99% works in services, hospitality industry, etc. So it's a welcome and it's low skill labor. The executive order that instructs the USTR to review CAFTA is also an important step forward. So my first question is, how are you aligning? How is the administration trying to align all of these things? Because the good governance, for example, good jobs part, the pledge, it's pretty much Chapter 16 of CAFTA, of the labor side agreement. So is there duplication or is there just reinforcement, and how are we really complying to it? Because I know for experience, yes, Nicaragua is not the Northern Triangle, But I mean, the labor rights violations are just overwhelmingly crazy. But we look at countries like Guatemala and Honduras, we do see a lot of problems in labor rights violations in the FTA, in the free trade zones. 60% of Central American exports to the US come from the textile manufacturing sector. So that's one question. How are we aligning all of these things? And the second question is, I mean, these are fascinating. I think it's great visibility for Central America to bring foreign investment. But there is a serious problem of rule of law right now. We're having serious problems in Guatemala. I mean, let's ignore Nicaragua for a second. The Honduran government wants to nationalize the energy sector. So, I mean, how are we inviting foreign investment in this context while the rule of law is really in trouble? So, I'm just trying to think of the alignment again between the objectives and the context that we are at. So those are my two questions. Then we will open.
Two very good questions. Thank you. The first one really does speak to the birth of Central America Forward. The call to action was focused on promoting economic investment, and Central America Forward represents a broadening of the aperture, a recognition that the private sector can bring so much more to the table as agents of change, as agents that are coming with an expectation of a certain business investment and environment, as actors who are going to require adherence to the rule of law to secure their investment, and as actors who can bring better labor standards as well. And so as you rightly point out, our strategy in Central America is multifaceted. It is not just to promote economic investment, but rather to use that economic investment, and this is what Central America Forward is seeking to do, to accomplish so much more, to really raise the standards of rule of law, fair labor, alongside the goals to create jobs. And I think I love the title of the Good Governance, Good Jobs Declaration, because it's private sector actors coming together to say we are here and not just creating jobs, but are here for good governance and good jobs, fair jobs, with fair wages and humane work environments. And your second question escapes me. Give me a keyword.
The wonderful conditions in Central America.
Oh, rule.
President Yamatei's selection, handpicked selection of a candidate to win the election.
So that's a great question as well. And first of all, I will not speak for private sector actors. Each of these companies are making their decisions based on their own risk calculus, their own needs, geographic needs, labor needs, supply chain needs. And companies I think there's a global shift that all of us in this room recognize, that is bringing jobs back from Asia to the Americas, call it nearshoring, friendshoring, aligning supply chains such that they're more proximate, geographically speaking. So companies are making these decisions for various reasons. And this goes back to my answer to your first question as well. In so doing, they are investing in the business climate in these countries, and they are determining deficiencies, identifying whether their risk calculus can support that, and then engaging with government officials in these countries to improve conditions for to shore up their investment, but also to raise standards such that it could have there can be better investment conditions writ large. And I think something else that we have focused on and determined in the root causes strategy that it should be a through line rather than its own kind of pillar is a focus on countering corruption. You see Central America Forward start to tackle this more head on as well. And the reason why we have focused so much on corruption is that we really do view it as a sickness, a cancer that can undermine governments and civil societies, and frankly, our objectives in Central America, every one of them, it can undermine security gains, economic gains, governance gains, and therefore we have very strict vetting protocols as to who can come in to join these the initiative, the call to action. We have been very focused through the good governance, good jobs declaration on efforts to combat corruption as well, because we view this as fundamental and essential, and something that has to run through each of our lines of effort in Central America in order for gains to be sustainable.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to see if anyone has questions. If you can please identify yourself too. We have 1, 2 on the left, 3 here. We can take 3 and then.
Hi, good morning. Daph Mendrala, great to see you again. Thanks so much for your comments today. I was wondering if you could, this is Martin Healy from CABE, actually. If you could flesh out a little bit about what exactly is an invest facilitation team? How does that work? I mean, is there dedicated personnel down in the embassies? Is there like a star chamber here of interagency looking at deals and trying to source it? I mean, how does it work, and how does that differ from American Cresse? Is that a new generation? Is it a approved model? Just how does it work, and how's it going to source these deals? And just as a quick side question, in terms of corruption in Honduras, is there any pressure to try to get the Honduran government to adopt this UN Commission on Anti-Corruption? Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Hi, Mary Speck from USIP. I'm just wondering what role, obviously the private sector is key and has not been engaged, at least very publicly, in the anti-corruption or governance issues. And I'm wondering what role civil society would have in that in order to monitor and oversight, because many companies do have declarations of ethics. But what role in this could civil society play in a positive way, not to monitor these commitments? Thank you.
Good morning, Louis Alexander from Glasswing. Continuing with the topic of the involvement of the private sector and civil society that was just asked about, and also in light of USAID's new localization strategy. Not so much for monitoring progress on corruption, but in terms of engaging local civil society in these countries, being engaged to a higher degree in collaboration with the private sector. The USAID more and more is looking for the private sector joining their programming so that there's a shared investment in the issues that organizations, be they international or local, are involved in. So how can these efforts help local civil society participate more actively with the private sector? Typically, the instruments used by our government are a bit challenging for local organizations. And there's some interesting proposals that are being made these days about sort of adjusting some of those to strengthen the engagement of local organizations in these countries.
Thank you.
Okay, great. I will take them in order. Thank you, Martin, for your question about the investment facilitation team. It is, as I noted, in its nascent stages. We have a kickoff this afternoon with a number of interagency partners, and we'll be bringing, as I said, we're also learning, we're building on lessons that have been learned in the Caribbean. And just yesterday, I had a great conversation with a colleague who's leading those efforts in the Caribbean to identify some of the best practices that they have adopted, the ways that they've seen synergies occur most effectively. And I think what we're envisioning right now, and welcome feedback from experts in this room as well, is coming together along a shared set of objectives. Governments in the region have a certain set of priorities. Civil societies do as well. Our team was in the region last week doing scoping missions to start to sort those out so that we can have a common set of shared priorities, and then getting U.S. government actors who each have a role to play on the continuum of concept to financing, bring them into the room to say, these are our shared priorities. What role can each of us play? And can we come together to do so in an efficient and an effective way? Again, the focus is clean energy infrastructure. So we've narrowed our scope and feel as though there are a number of opportunities, a number of projects that are already in the pipeline. There's a need for technical assistance to create better environments so that there can be, even more projects brought into the pipeline so that the U.S. government can then plug in. And our plugging in looks different depending on the department or agency and the role that they play. There's everything from technical assistance to development assistance through USAID to DFC to XM financing. And so I think the specific US government involvement is going to depend a lot on the project that's moving through the pipeline. But there's a lot to learn. Our team had a fascinating trip down to the 3 North and Central American countries last week. They were looking both at the investments that have come online, making good on commitments under the partnership, under the call to action, and also starting to identify some of these key priorities for the investment facilitation team. And then, Mary, your question is a good one about the role that civil society can play in monitoring anti-corruption. There are a couple of different places in the process that I see this plugging in. First, I noted that all companies who are participating in the call to action are vetted. And we also are looking at vetting protocols for the investment facilitation team as well. The information that we use in these vetting efforts, some of it comes from public source, a lot of that generated from civil society actors. So there's a really important role that civil society plays on a daily basis that is ongoing and identifying and calling out corruption in countries around the world, and in Central America. There's a very vibrant and brave and valiant effort on the part of civil society actors calling that out and shining a light on it. And then also we envision it through Central America Forward that there will be many opportunities for us to be working with a diverse set of stakeholders against these new lines of effort, and welcome an ongoing conversation about the best role for civil society in that process. And then for the role of civil society in partnership with the private sector, a lot of the companies who have made commitments under the call to action have goals alongside their financial commitments and are already making good on those. I mentioned some of them in my opening about connecting individuals to the formal banking system, internet access, gender equity, there are already organic partnerships springing up between private sector actors and local civil society. You mentioned USAID's localization effort that is phenomenal and really hard for the reasons that you also articulated, because some of the structures that we have in the US government for compliance in our grant making process sometimes conflict out small and local organizations that may not have the bandwidth or the capacity to meet the standards that are required. The USAID's Central America Local initiative starts to address that, and to do so in a small scale pilot way, but in a way that we are learning lessons from to seek to expand those initiatives.
Thank you. I think, yeah, the localization approach, it's quite important, especially in the current context. And we'll perhaps ask you a few more questions on that. Before I turn it to the floor, we have a couple of questions from the Zooming audience. One from our colleague, Mark Snyder. He always asks good questions. So I'm going to read it. The focus on governance is crucial, and the place for anti-corruption is as well. The proof of the pudding is on monitoring compliance. Who is going to be monitoring compliance on these pledges? And then we have a question from Mariana Lippi. Can you elaborate on where the private sector support is coming from? Is this mostly US private sector? Are you able to name a few private sectors actors who have been instrumental thus far? That's an easy one.
Okay, great. The proof is in the pudding. You're right, Mark. For monitoring and compliance, that's going to take place in a few different ways. Hold on, let me find the samples that I have.
We have companies like Cargill, Grupo Terra, Microsoft.
Okay, I'll find it in a second. So we are working in partnership with the Partnership for Central America, our private sector partner, who is working directly with companies as they are coming forward with financial pledges. And $4.2 billion in private sector contributions is a large number. And it came together very quickly over the course of 18 months. And we are very focused at this stage in understanding what the timeline is for those investments, where exactly they're going to come online, and understand that many of these companies are already engaging with foreign government partners to put some of the details together for these investments. I noted that some of them have already come online. We have some numbers and figures about the dollar amounts that have been contributed that corresponds to the jobs created, individuals connected to the formal banking system, connected to the internet. So we're starting to see progress, but we are very, very focused on and engaged with companies as they are putting these investments in place. And as far as the monitoring and compliance around anti-corruption, the companies themselves are have held themselves to certain standards based on commitments that they've made in other fora. We have also undergone a rigorous vetting procedure for those companies that are a part of the call to action. And this is something that we think is super important because this is kind of a good governance club. This is a club of good actors that have committed and have aligned themselves with the goals of this administration to promote societies in Central America that are prosperous, safe, democratic, secure, and for them to come into this club alongside the U.S. government in our efforts in Central America, we have to hold them to certain standards. And there are so many good actors out there that are keen to do good while doing well. Is that the phrase? That we want to harness those efforts and we want to bring those actors into the tent. And so that's the reason for the rigorous vetting, and that's the reason for the standards that we have. And I'll continue to dig for the examples, but I do know off the top of my head some of the companies that came under the most recent on the launch of Central America Forward. We had new companies that came to the table. One of them is Chegg, which is an online language proficiency company. I'm probably going to bungle it, so sorry, Chegg, if you're listening. But they are they have not come forward with a financial commitment, but rather an in-kind commitment to provide education services to a large cohort of Hondurans specifically. And this was kind of an innovative way that we saw the partnership expand under the Central America Forward initiative. We also have, for example, Parkdale Mills in Honduras committed to investing $150 million to support a new yarn spinning facility in Honduras. They have begun construction of a 900,000 square foot spinning facility in Honduras, and they're creating direct jobs, but also indirect jobs. There are several kind of secondary employment opportunities that come from an initiative like that. Guatemala, we have Yasaki North America, an automotive components producer. They've invested in a $10 million factory in Guatemala, creating over 1,000 jobs. Yasaki North America provides electrical wire harnesses for General Motors, Ford, and other global automakers. In El Salvador, Unify, a company that produces recycled and synthetic yarns, is making significant investments in the footprint, capacity, and innovation of its Salvadoran operation, and has committed to investing $15 million over the next 5 years to expand capacity, improve efficiency, and reduce energy use. The investment includes new innovative texturing technology that will increase the company's polyester yarn production in El Salvador by 40%. And support continuous training and job growth in the region. Those are a couple of examples.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we have questions on this side and on the right side. We have one question. Matt.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for this conversation. My name is Maria Fernandez and I'm from Internews. The question that I have is related to the private sector linked to good governance as well. There are certain sectors like the media sector that in order to operate as a private entity, it needs to have some certain conditions that are very much linked to good governance or to democratic principles. Is there any part of the strategy that is looking at those sectors that are a little bit in between? Thank you.
Matt over here.
Thanks. Good morning. Matt DePel with the National Democratic Institute. Following up a little bit on Mark Schneider's question, do you see opportunities for improving government compliance on some of the rule of law, good governance provisions? For example, U.S. using its sway in multilateral lending institutions. Do you see a role that U.S. can play in the elections? Manuel flagged already in Guatemala. Those outcomes will probably determine a lot of the, I would guess, the success and the probability of good rule of law going forward. Do you see a role that you can play from that side, on the democracy side, to promote some of these initiatives?
Thank you. One more question on that side. Who's winning? That the left? 3-2-0.
Good morning, Lauren Molina from McLarty Associates. Thank you for your comments today. To clarify, having Central America Forward and the good governance, good job initiative building upon PCA. Just wanted to know what the role of is it going to be the same folks from the call to action who are participating in this new initiative? Are there opportunities? You mentioned Chegg coming forward for the new Central America initiative. So are there folks who are going to join this now, the private sector? Do they have to be a part of PCA to be a part of this new declaration, new initiative? So if you can talk a little bit more about the implementation of the new program.
Thank you.
To both Maria Fernandez and Matt, your question, I'm going to take the two together. The U.S. government is engaged in Central America on efforts far beyond Central America Forward and the call to action. I know you know that, and we are working with partners across civil society, independent media, election monitors. In the case of Guatemala, there's already an OAS election observation mission in Guatemala, done in partnership with the Guatemalan government. And to address a whole host of priority issues. We have tools such as public diplomacy, tools such as foreign assistance, tools such as sanctions as well. We have a broad array of tools that we use and that we can use to address the goals that we have vis-a-vis Central America to promote good governance, to promote economic development, to promote security, combat climate change, and otherwise. And so the efforts that we're talking about here today, Central America Forward, represent an important broadening of the aperture with our partnerships with private sector entities to go beyond a focus on just job creation and investment in Central America, but to see the private sector actors as important change agents, bring alongside important U.S. government efforts to underpin private sector growth as well. And to focus on good governance and good jobs. And so the short answer to both of your questions is yes. We are working with partners across the spectrum to advance our goals. And one initiative that I'll mention that I suspect you're familiar with is the Voices initiative that was launched by Administrator Power last year at the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. And this is an initiative to protect and defend civic space, and brings together civil society actors, independent media, and efforts from the U.S. government, both the State Department and USAID, to work across several lines of effort, including to combat digital authoritarianism, for example. And this is a really dynamic and innovative space, and there are a lot of civil society actors in Central America that are doing incredible work. Some of them supported by U.S. government efforts, and some of them supported by foundations and other actors across the world to engage in this really important and vital task right now to protect and defend an ever shrinking civic space in Central America, something that has garnered alarm. Lauren, to your question about about the implementation of Central America Forward, there are companies who have joined the call to action and have made investments under the umbrella of the call to action. Our primary partner for the U.S. government in the call to action is the Partnership for Central America. And they joined with us as a quasi-representative of the call to action participants to put forward this good jobs, good governance declaration. And it was intended to, and is intended to, signal that that we are all working to leverage the energy, the momentum, the investments of the private sector to do more than just create jobs, to raise the standards for governance, to improve the conditions of rule of law, to improve the labor environment, and to do so with a goal of, for some of the private sector companies, this is kind of a self-focused, what's the word I'm looking for? A selfish proposition on their part, because it improves the investment climate. As you see rule of law improve, you see governance improve, you see the investment climate benefit. That's a better condition for companies to come and invest in these countries. And so that is the incentive for the private sector actors to come to the table and join with us on this good governance, good jobs declaration. And I think further to your question, kind of who else is joining, there are other actors who are keen to be a part of this, to be a part of the effort to join with the U.S. government and align with our initiatives in Central America. And so we are all the time entertaining new requests, new pledges to come under the umbrella of call to action. There's also a really intense focus on implementation, seeing these commitments translate to actual investments, see these commitments translate to actual, not just financial investments, but investments in the social indicators that these companies have pledged to support as well, around gender equity, formalizing the economy, education, and other initiatives that these companies have brought forward.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. I'm going to read two from the Zooming colleagues. one from Kimberly Stanton, especially that you mentioned environment a few times. So she asks, how did the administration choose to focus on clean energy infrastructure? Was this a demand from the region, either governmental or non-governmental, or is it more a reflection of the administration focus on ameliorating climate change? Then another interesting question from our colleague from Guatemala, Edgar Villanueva. He asked, are there thoughts on an additional mechanism to build a comprehensive economic agenda between the United States and Central America, a sort of US Central America high-level economy and investment dialogue? It seems that the call for action and Central America Forward involve the private sector, but not the government as much. So, how do we get the Central American governments to?
Okay, great. Over to me.
Yeah, over to you.
Okay, clean energy infrastructure. Why do we focus on that? I suspect it's an all, I confess I don't have the full picture into the sausage making that led to that as the priority, but I confess that it is, or I suspect that it is our priority to focus on clean energy, and it is the governments and the region's priority as well, recognition that to the extent that they need infrastructure investments, we have to, in this day and age, focus on clean energy infrastructure. It is the way of the future. It is the way of now, and it would be folly to spend a lot of time and energy to invest in infrastructure that wasn't going to be compliant with or conducive to the way that this industry is moving. As to Edgar's question, it seems to me like he's proposing to organize a high-level dialogue, and I look forward to talking with him about it. There is absolutely a role for governments in the region, and we are engaging them. And in fact, the U.S. government engages them all the time. The Partnership for Central America engages them all the time. Companies themselves are, of course, engaging with them as they are working through their own efforts and initiatives. The idea of a high-level dialogue is one that is very interesting. I think we can certainly explore it more. We have, I will say a lot is happening at the bilateral level as well. There is an interest from Guatemala, for example, to do a supply chain dialogue. And it's really important to understand vulnerabilities in supply chain, to be able to shore up those vulnerabilities, to assess how our efforts right now are kind of filling gaps that governments have identified. And we're doing a lot of that at the bilateral level. I know in the past there has been a tremendous cooperation among countries from Northern Central America with recognition that their economies are interlinked, and the need to harmonize customs standards, for example, so that trade can flow more easily and quickly across the three governments. And I suspect that there's a lot more room for opportunity there as well.
Seems that the demand for dialogue is really imperative. And I mean, Ricardo Zúñiga could play an important role in bringing that type of dialogue. And we'll be happy at the dialogue to promote that dialogue, because we do need that conversation and the compliance to a lot of the commitments, even from Central American governments at this juncture in the three countries for sure. Rebecca.
So I hope this question isn't too much in the weeds, but we've talked in the past about the gender issue, and when it comes to the root causes of migration, the increasing number of women that are migrating especially from the Northern Triangle or Northern Central America. And at the dialogue, we have recently launched this initiative on women's economic empowerment across the region, but I think that Central America, it's particularly critical because it also addresses things like gender-based violence. If you have the economic independence, it's easier to leave a situation like that, which also, of course, drives migration. So you mentioned that the role of the private sector, it's not just sort of the investment and the job creation, that the private sector is also playing a role in increasing connectivity, in digital upskilling and that sort of thing. So one of the big challenges facing women in the region is the digital divide, the gender digital divide. And I don't know if you have any of this on you or if a member of your team does, but I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that, what that looks like, kind of increasing connectivity, or any examples from the private sector.
It's a great question, and one that we have focused on, and I confess I'm not super deep on it, so I'll give you what I know. But many of the companies who are coming forward, as I note, have made financial commitments, but also commitments to address socioeconomic indicators as well. One initiative that has kind of arisen out of the call to action is the In Her Hands initiative. And this is a focus on gender equity. And I think it can manifest in several different ways. It can manifest in gender equity in hiring. It can manifest in gender equity in kind of program development programming. And what you are talking about, Rebecca, is super important as well. And the bridging the digital divide and giving more financial tools to women, many of them women heads of household, who are without without connectivity and without participation in the formal economy, do not have all of the tools that could otherwise be available to them to make financial decisions for their household, to have financial autonomy. And so it's one of the reasons that this has been such a chief focus of ours. There is a really strong gender equity component in the root causes strategy as well, and something that we are that we're focused on through U.S. government programming, and also encouraging companies that are coming forward as part of the call to action to focus on as well, with the recognition that there are any number of opportunities that could be gained, but also risks if we don't focus on this, risks to see more family-based migration, for example, risks to see more internal displacement, risks for domestic violence. There are any number of risks associated with failing to focus on this as a chief focus area.
Thank you. We have a question here. Do we have any questions on this side? One in the back, the lady, then number 2, number 3. We have a few minutes left.
Hi, yeah, I'm Miriam Sykes from USIP. I had a question to follow up a bit on the last online question that came about kind of the mechanisms, or that these private sector companies are engaging with local governments. I guess my question is kind of, would they consider themselves like champions for kind of best practices in anti-corruption and rule of law, or are they more people who are businesses that are showing this behavior and kind of offering an example of ways to engage with fair labor practices and kind of unkept ways, and then there's like a parallel track of engaging governments in trying to kind of make sure that these reforms and this way of working in the private sector become systemic? Or do they actually consider themselves kind of people who are also leading and engaging directly with the government to kind of promote these reforms or ways of engaging in the private sector?
Thank you. We have one here, and
Thank you. I was wondering if you might be able to share with us some update on, and building on the question from Guatemala about engagement by local governments. There was a lot going on a few years ago, and I'm not remembering if it was started by the previous administration or not, where commitments were being made by local governments on dealing with irregular migration, collaborative
for
with the
Central
region, all
America.
that. And so we haven't heard a lot about that lately in the airwaves or in
A4P.
reports or
Alliance for
updates, speaking
Prosperity.
about updates, and holding governments accountable and so forth. So I was wondering if you could share any updates on that.
Hello, my name is Yadira Sanchez Barasa. I'm with the Latin America Working Group. My question is about the vetting that you discussed earlier. We talked a lot about the vetting for these private investments to come in. So what happens, you mentioned some projects in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. So what happens if, in 6 months or a year, people do come forward and they discuss abuses around labor, other things? What kind of accountability is the US government going to have to make sure that those projects that do have, a lot of positivity right now, but if people do come forward, what's the accountability that we're going to see? And what are any kind of review mechanisms that are going to happen the next 1, 5, if this project continues even longer than that?
Okay. Miriam, to your question, it's both and all of the above. I think a lot of it depends on the kind of the personality and the posture of the private sector actors. There are some who see themselves as kind of advocates for change and are very forward leaning, and others who want to lead by example and let their the standards that they bring into the market set the tone. And what we are doing under Call to Action and now under Central America Forward is recognizing that these private sector actors have so much to bring and are putting a greater emphasis on it through the Good Governance, Good Jobs Declaration, kind of putting some language to exactly what it is that we see this initiative can do and can bring to improve rule of law, to improve the investment climate, to improve conditions for labor, and articulating that, making it clear to government actors, to other private sector actors that this is kind of what we stand for collectively as a group. The question about local government engagement, holding governments accountable, are you talking about around kind of, you mentioned holding them accountable for migration? Can you?
I think it was the Alliance for Prosperity.
One of the initiatives that we've not talked about this morning is the collaborative migration management strategy. The Manuel referenced the executive order that, and Rebecca did as well, that President Biden issued in February of 2021 that asked the executive to take a look at migration in a comprehensive way, to put in place a strategy to address root causes of migration, to reform policies at the border, and to do a third thing that was frankly a little bit new, which was to talk about the way that the region can work together and that we can work in a regional way to address migration challenges. The collaborative migration management strategy put in place a strategy on the part of the US government that then eventually was adapted and became the Los Angeles Declaration for Migration and Protection, around which now 22 countries from the region have supported, and this was rolled out at the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles last year. And the Los Angeles Declaration for Migration and Protection, it is not the collaborative migration management strategy, but many of the tenets are similar. And what it says is that collectively as a region, we need to be focused on enhanced border enforcement. We need to be focused on improving legal pathways for migration. We've talked a lot about the expansion of temporary work opportunities for Central Americans. But there are many other legal pathways that we've stood up to the United States, that countries around the world have stood up, focused on the Americas. Canada is expanding its refugee resettlement, its temporary work opportunities. Spain as well is expanding its temporary work opportunities. identifying ways that we can make legal pathways bigger, stronger, more easily accessible. Another tenet of the Los Angeles Declaration is a focus on protection. And protection takes many forms. Protection looks like refugee resettlement. It also looks like temporary protection, that we've seen countries in South America be so generous in offering temporary protection. Costa Rica as well, for Nicaraguans, offering temporary protection for their neighbors who are fleeing harsh circumstances and providing them access to services and resettlement support. The Los Angeles Declaration focuses on internal displacement. It focuses on family reunification. And the, what's meaningful, one of the things that's most meaningful about the Los Angeles Declaration is a recognition that the region needs to be working together to address migration, and it manifests for every country in the region differently, and that we all have things that we can offer and support. We all have needs that we need support from other countries in the region, and it is a kind of framework under which we can work together. So that, I think, is in Central America, there is a great focus on internal displacement. Honduras just recently passed, it had long been considering an IDP law that would provide a legal framework for internal displacement. It recently passed that law. We are seeing Guatemala improving its asylum system. And I think we're seeing Spain, as I mentioned, growing legal pathways for Central Americans who have economic needs and are looking for temporary work. Spain has grown its temporary work opportunities for Central Americans. And so these are just a few outcomes that are associated with the Los Angeles Declaration. And the final question about vetting and labor and accountability. It's a great question. We are very focused, as I mentioned, on vetting, making sure that this Good Governance Club is just that. It is a club that has high standards, that we are holding ourselves and others to account. And so therefore we are doing rigorous vetting on the front end. We are also mindful that there are a number of accountability mechanisms that are in place now through CAFTA, through other international bodies. And I fully expect that we would make full use of US laws, the agreements to which we are a party. Countries in the region will also be bound to enforce their laws as well. It's something that we would also welcome an ongoing dialogue. This is something that is so important to us, to be making sure that we are holding ourselves to a high standard, and that the companies with whom we're associated are holding themselves to a high standard as well.
Thank you very much. We are close to ending, so we're gonna take a couple of questions here, and then I'm going to read one more question from the Zooming audience. I see there is the gentleman next to Rebecca has a question, and then Martin 2.0 question.
Hello, good morning. My name is Guillermo Matuti. I'm from the Honduran Embassy here in DC. Thank you, Deputy Mendrala, for this opportunity, and you also, Manuel. My questions are like, how can new companies at national or regional level in Central America be part of the CFA, like the Call for Action Initiative? And also, I think we can establish and develop better communication lines with embassies here, because I know you have connections or contacts with national government and private sector, but sometimes embassies, we feel like we're like not left out, but not enough communication with us. So thank you.
Martin.
Thank you. Okay, first and last, right? Okay, just quickly in terms of China. China is aggressively expanding in the region, as we all know. They're got their sights set on the 3 countries that do not diplomatically recognize them right now: Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras in particular. My question is, with the emphasis on developing clean energy technology infrastructure, those are big projects, multi-million, hundreds of $1 million. China has a very spotty track record of implementation within the region. how do you generate that kind of interest and bring up that type of hundreds of $1 million worth of investment while keeping China out of that whole picture? Thanks.
Thank you. I'm just going to read one question before we close. This is from our colleague, Tom Hare from Notre Dame. What research is sort of a concept note, let's call it. What research or evidence do you and your team need to track, manage, and adapt efforts like Central America Forward? And I mean, I think the question goes back again to Mark Snyder and the issue of compliance, especially, I mean, as I was reading some of the commitments of Central America Forward, they, you know, on our field of work, on financial inclusion, they say that they will financially include at least 6 million individuals and provide 1 million small businesses with access to financing by 2027. And so, you know, it's hard to make sense of these numbers. Right now, we have 5.7 million bank account owners in the Northern Triangle. And by 2027, through natural growth, it will be 6.9 million people. So, you know, will the the Central America Forward will claiming credit for 90% of that? Or, you know, how are we really going to do this metric piece of the work? So thank you.
Thank you. Guillermo, great to meet you, and well noted on the need for better communication. We will certainly follow up. I've had great conversations with Ambassador Boo, who indicated that he has a whole team that's going to be dedicated to working on this, facilitating connections with companies, and it's really important. And we will do our part from our team to have better communication, both at the State Department as well as with the Office of the Vice President. We are working hand in glove with them on this initiative. As far as new companies coming forward, please do pass that to us. The Partnership for Central America is the entity that is engaging most closely with companies. I believe the embassy has contact with them, but if not, we can certainly facilitate it. And the role of governments, both national governments back home as well as embassies here in Washington, is incredibly important to plug into this process. Martin, your question about China is good, and you somewhat answered it in your question. I think our posture has long been that the U.S. government endeavors to be a strong and a sustainable and a credible partner, and we are partnering with actors who are doing the same. We have seen indications that sometimes China's investment in the region does not live up to the standards that that investment from other countries would, and feel as though it's important for us to be present in a strong way with the investment standards that we hold ourselves to, and demonstrate through that example that we and our partners are the partners of choice. And then Tom, your question / concept note was also a very good one. And I think Manuel, perhaps you can partner up with Manuel to put together a joint concept note on monitoring and evaluation. And I'll take the opportunity to not so much talk about metrics associated with this objective, but to rather indicate that the U.S. government run out working with USAID and the Department of State, the Office of Central American Affairs, has developed a rigorous monitoring and evaluation tool that we are using to assess our efforts against the root causes strategy writ large. This is something that is incredibly important, as you know, and as many of you in this room know, that it is an imperfect science to try to capture exactly what outcomes are associated with what investments and what efforts and initiatives on the part of which actor. Nevertheless, we are trying to dig into that. We've been at the business of addressing root causes in Central America for a while now. We've talked today about the U.S. strategy for engagement in Central America that was born under the Obama administration. And here we are several years later talking about some of the same challenges, the same root causes of migration in Central America. We've learned a lot. And that was also part of the directive that President Biden gave us in the executive order in February of 2021 was learn from our efforts that we have done over the years and do it better. So we culled through the monitoring and evaluation that we had on hand in the spring of 2021 as we were crafting the root causes strategy. And we have also put in place now a monitoring and evaluation effort that is going to coincide with our efforts under the root causes strategy going forward so that we can continue to learn. There have been gains for sure. There are also exogenous factors who in 2015, 2014, when the U.S. strategy for engagement with Central America was born, would have anticipated a global pandemic in 2020, and the challenges that has wrought throughout the world, but certainly in Central America as well. That said, there's a lot that we have learned. There are a lot of best practices that are continuing to be kind of developed and identified in this space, and we are seeking through an ongoing learning effort to capture those and plug those into our efforts.
Thank you very much to everyone, and thank you, Emily, for this exchange. It seems to me that there are at least three takeaways from this conversation and these initiatives. I mean, the first one is it's a sense of having a stronger alignment, policy alignment among the different frameworks that are out there in the administration, trying to put together a comprehensive approach to really address the issue of migration, but also all of the other problems that we're dealing with: economic prosperity, rule of law, and more recently, climate change. The second one, the Snyder clause, we can call it, it's the compliance issue. We do need to look into, how to ensure that there is compliance to what we are committing to beyond lip service to it. And then third is cooperation, especially cooperation with governments in the region to ensure that, this effort is not only coming one way, but it's also closing circle with the regional partners, because we are definitely at the stage in the region, especially where we're dealing with complex cooperating problems with non-cooperative partners to some extent. And so we have to break that mold, and conditions in the region are really at some of the worst points, the lowest points since, the civil war. I mean, I sometimes I wonder if we're worse than the civil wars with the state of affairs in the region. But with that, thank you very much. And any last words?
A huge thank you to you, Manuel, to Rebecca, to the dialogue, and to all of you. Your good questions that have given us great food for thought. And I know that we welcome ongoing conversations as this initiative continues to develop, and we are implementing it in the months and years to come. Many thanks.